And we're live. Hello, everyone. I will make a quick intro in Portuguese and then we'll move to English. Oi, pessoal. Hoje, mais uma vez, nós temos o prazer de receber no nosso Papo de Mercado um convidado internacional, o Robert Appleton, Bob Appleton. Ele tem uma história fantástica, enfim, em todo o setor de compliance e anti-lavagem de dinheiro. Vou deixar ele contar um pouco dessa história. A gente vai seguir a entrevista em inglês, como a gente sempre faz. Obrigado a todos por estarem aqui presentes. Hello, Bob. Thank you so
Hello,
much for
Gabriel.
joining us. It's a pleasure having you here with us.
No, thank you. I'm honored to be here.
Oh, fantastic. Amazing. I'm pretty sure our viewers will have a lot to learn from today. Can you please make an intro about you, tell a bit about your fantastic story and
Sure.
where it led you to where you are, how it led you to where you
Sure,
are right
sure.
now?
Yeah, sure. So, I'm obviously a lawyer, but I started out as a prosecutor with the Department of Justice, U.S. Department of Justice, for more than 13 years. And, after law school, I had clerked for a very prominent federal judge in the U.S., and I went into the DOJ and became a criminal prosecutor. And I was very fortunate. I had some great mentors, and also was able to lead some huge cases. I prosecuted Jose Stro, which was at the time Pablo Escobar's principal money launderer. That was lead on that case.
Wow.
I prosecuted the first Al-Qaeda fundraising terrorist in the United Kingdom, brought him to the U.S. Many international weapons, money laundering, and financial crimes. And then in 2005, I was offered a post with former Fed Chair Paul Volcker, who was leading at the time the investigation into the Iraqi oil for food program, and also the participation allegedly of the then Secretary General Kofi Annan. And so I led the procurement team and what was called the oil for food investigation. I had a staff of about 40. Mr. Volcker and I actually did the deposition of the Secretary General Kofi Annan at the time, and so it was a fascinating experience. And then after that, which was a temporary assignment, the UN asked me to run their first anti-corruption unit. That was in 2006. And I ran that for 3 years in the UN, where we were responsible for the entire UN operations to examine their programs for instances of fraud and corruption, mismanagement, financial irregularity. And after that, I moved to Switzerland, where I led I was the Deputy Inspector General and also the head of investigations at the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, where I then spent quite a bit of time in Africa, Asia, Latin America, examining fraud and corruption in big donor programs in the health sector. And then I came and finally went into private practice, where now I help individuals, corporations in cross-border cases with the Department of Justice or compliance matters. Also, I represent whistleblowers before the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. I help, in fact, I'm involved very heavily in the Brazil Lava Jato cases, representing Brazilians that are being targeted by authorities, as well as civil and administrative cases. And I help a number of Brazilian corporations and also individuals with cross-border issues with either their companies or regulatory challenges that they have, in the U.S.
I mean, yeah, you could write at least 10 books only with the stories.
Yeah, got a few started, I must say.
So
yeah.
many interesting things, Bob.
Yeah, no, it's been quite a ride. It's been a terrific, terrific run. I've had some really great experiences, and yeah, some pretty hairy experiences too in Africa and Asia, where things got a little dicey. But everything worked out. But seen a lot.
Well, you definitely have to have a hard shell to deal with those cases, don't you?
Oh yeah, you gotta have a thick skin.
A thick skin.
You can't, you can't be thin-skinned, especially when you're inside some of these organizations. It's a real challenge. Yeah.
And how did you wind up dealing with Brazil and the Lava Jato scandal and
Yeah.
all that?
No, it's a great question. So interesting. I mean, it was interesting at the time. The head of the FBI and also the head of the Department of Justice that were leading the cases in Brazil were actually very close colleagues of mine, former colleagues, close friends. So I had, I was very familiar with what was going on in Brazil, and it was interesting. So the FBI, when the lead agent of the cases actually left the bureau before the cases were finished, and so we actually together decided, look, this is very unique. There's a close cooperation, a really tight partnership between the Brazilian MPF and the DOJ and the FBI. The public should hear about it. So we actually presented, it was the first significant public event, which was in Sao Paulo in February 2018. We put on a conference that included the head of the Brazil Federal Police, the heads of the MPF, the heads of the DOJ and the FBI, and it was an absolute sellout. I mean, the tickets were sold in the first 3 hours. I think it was the International Chamber of Commerce in Sao Paulo helped put the whole program on.
Were you expecting that?
No, we thought, maybe we'll get a few dozen people, and it should be interesting. And then it was a flood, an absolute flood. They had to open up a separate room with, with a satellite, and they had to video link it. And it was quite unusual. I mean, it's the first time that the authorities, both of the authorities, talked publicly about what had happened in the case, and and also to correct the record and kind of clarify how the cases started, and what really was the goal, and who and why got wrapped up into it. So it was fascinating, and that really kind of launched me. I mean, after that, I spent quite a bit of time in Sao Paulo and also other Rio and other parts of Brazil, and then I got to begin helping Brazilians with U.S. issues and doing a lot of cross-border work between the two countries, and it's been fascinating. I mean, there's really, in the UN where I was, doing a lot of international work, I had some interaction with Latin America and Brazil, but not, a ton. I mean, the work was more focused in Africa and Asia, and this was my first foray really into Latin America in a deeper level, and I was very impressed by not only the legal system, but I found that the two countries, the two systems were very closely connected. There's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of connection, and despite one thing I also saw was certainly the growing relationship and connection between China and Brazil. But I've still found that the U.S. Brazil connection was very strong. A lot of lawyers, like yourself, who either educated in some way or spent some time in the U.S. before they went back to Brazil to practice, or spent time in the U.S. practicing law, and there's a very solid, strong bond. In New York, where I am, there's a very strong Brazilian presence, and now it's turned out that the Brazil is almost 75% of my practice, really.
Whoa.
So. Yeah, so it's very active right now.
I don't know if that, considering where you focus, I don't know if that's good news or bad news.
Yeah,
but
no, it's not all corruption cases. Definitely other things. So,
and that's actually that's one big question that I have for you, because
Sure.
well, criminal activity is criminal activity, of course, But then there's the kind of innocent bystander, or some people that unwillingly end up breaking up a few laws, and they may face serious consequences because of that. Especially, we work on the innovation front, so new businesses, startup businesses, etc. They're often, and they have to be mindful sometimes with where regulations stand. And
Right.
I
Sure.
like your feel about that. I mean, do you see that a lot? And which would be the basic red flags for any entrepreneur, any people
Yeah.
wanting
Yeah.
wanting to
No, I
do
think
business?
it's a really great point. I mean, it's in fact, I'm involved in a couple of matters where it's very unfortunate what had happened, because I think a lot of the matters snowballed, or actually got further than it should have, because of really a miscommunication or a lack of understanding. And I think, part of, one of the, obviously the underlying current with criminal cases is there's got to be criminal intent for there to be a criminal case. And a lot of times I've seen where, as you say, there hasn't been that criminal intent, there's been a mistake. Where someone has, done something perhaps not entirely consistent with the regulatory requirements or the legal framework, but their intention wasn't to commit a crime or to steal money. I'm actually involved in one case now where it's quite unfortunate, and I think we're trying to unwind that, and hopefully it's not too late. But one of the things to do, if there's really a question, is to ask. I mean, because there's even if there's been a misstep, there is often ways out of it. There's ways to mitigate the penalty, to keep it from escalation, and just like to dovetail for a second, for example, like even in the compliance regulatory framework, the way like the DOJ or the way the U.S. government assesses a penalty or a fine, half of the equation is really the good intention or the bad intention of the individual or the company. And if you can demonstrate a real, sincere effort to try and do the right thing, to try and get it right, to take those steps to, put yourself in a position where you're trying to, adhere to the regulatory framework, you're going to get credit for that. It's going to be helpful, and there's often, a way to, like I said, mitigate or lessen the potential outcome or penalty, and the way you react to it, and the way you try to approach it. Now, the opposite is also true, wherein if there's an effort to conceal, an effort to hide, and that kind of a thing is going to exacerbate the situation, unfortunately. But really, there's a lot of control the individual or the company has in the outcome, if in fact you do try and do the right thing. And one of the things I'm doing, working with companies, and I find it somewhat challenging sometimes, is to try and persuade both companies and individuals to get ahead of the issue, get ahead of what might be a problem, and create a framework and create a compliance structure where you're at least trying to mitigate the risk. And if you do that, and it's sincere, and it'll be recognized, and it'll do you a lot of good. It'll actually work very much in your favor. But the one thing I would strongly suggest is don't wait until there's a knock on your door. I mean, that's always the worst approach. Really the framework today has changed more so than any time in history. And one of the things is, I think some of your viewers and folks may know, is that there are whistleblower reward programs in the U.S. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the IRS, the DOJ they strongly promote reporting. And there have been some pretty substantial rewards. And now, like a third of the awards last year went to individuals outside the U.S. And in fact, 2 Brazilians were amongst the most heavily rewarded or paid for their cooperation, about U.S. subsidiaries that are operating in Brazil of a U.S. parent. So there's two real strong messages there. One is, there's this new kind of structure. There's this framework out there where there is now an ability for private citizens to be rewarded for reporting misconduct. But in the same token, if you're a company, a multinational, or there's no safe place to hide. I mean, you've got to, and what I tell my clients is you've got to assume that there's going to be people from within your organization that are going to report. So, therefore, do your best to mitigate the risk and get out in front of any issue before it becomes a problem. And it's going to be worth the effort. And it's funny. I mean, it's often difficult, especially it's been difficult with my U.S. clients, even to convince them to put in the effort and investment into compliance to mitigate a risk that hasn't materialized. I mean, maybe it's part of human nature. I don't know, but if you look at the cases now, I mean, some of the fines that have come out recently. I mean, we're now talking, we're not talking millions anymore. We're now in the billions. The Ericsson, the Swedish company with global operations, just got fined $1 billion.
Wow.
More than $1 billion. And now they've got to monitor, and it's a disaster for that company. And I look at
and then comes the impact. It's stock markets and the brand of the company, and that could put a company out of business
without question. I mean, a big corporate Fortune 500 company can maybe withstand a fine like that, but smaller companies aren't going to be able to withstand multi-million-dollar fines and penalties, and that's now this is where we're at now. And again, if you look at cross-border situations and the Brazilian-U.S. situation, the Brazilian authorities and the U.S. authorities work very closely together now. There's a very open line of communication. There's not much that goes on that the other doesn't know about now. And so you've got to assume that the world has really shrunk, and what happens in one location, we'll get to the other one in a very short order. And while, COVID certainly has interrupted that a little, things are getting back to normal, and it's only a short-term hiatus.
Well, in terms of those international structures, I mean, the world has shrunk, definitely, but are there still places that are opaque? And do people that operate on those places, do they get a bad rap? And do prosecutors look closely to them? Yeah,
there are some, but they're getting much smaller and getting very much more fewer because it's really a situation now where there is few places to hide. I mean, it's still possible. If you've got you want to put in the effort, but the traditional, safe havens, Switzerland, Caymans, the British VI, and some of these other places are not so safe anymore. There's been strong pressure on those locations to provide information to regulators. So, you really can't bank on safe havens so much anymore. And so it's very difficult. And you look at some of these cases where they've gotten a lot of publicity that have come on and been publicized on different websites and outlets where there's been hacks or breaches, and everything is public. So it's very hard these days to be completely anonymous.
Yes. And in terms of those multinational prongs, one interesting case that happened, I mean, this last couple of weeks was the BitMEX case. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, I've been reading about it. Yeah.
So even though they have no presence officially in the U.S., the CEO, I don't know if he was arrested, but there's a warrant against him, and they're looking for him because they didn't take enough precautions to fulfill the U.S. regulations.
Correct. Right.
How do you protect yourself against those things?
No question. I mean, it shows you there's no place to hide. I mean, one other aggravating factor was, according to the media, who knows if it's actually the case, was that the CEO, thumbed his nose at the regulators and basically flaunted that, he was going to be immune and not reachable. So he outwardly challenged the regulators, and of course they're going to take him up on it. And that's the reality. I think a lot of times I've had clients who don't fully grasp that even though you may not have an activity inside the United States, there's a lot of the regulation. Well, there's two things. One is that the regulatory framework is what's called extraterritorial in many aspects. So we can debate, the correctness, the rightness, or wrongness of that. But, the reality is that there are regulations that reach outside the borders of the U.S. FCPA is one good example, but there are also the regulatory framework surrounding fintech, cryptocurrency. That's number one. And number two is that there's now the ability to reach beyond the borders too. Just the capacity of regulators to act outside the country, and when you have cooperation from other countries, it's becomes easier to do that. And it's a situation now where you've really got to be mindful of that, because even I've actually got situations that I'm working on where the individuals can't leave their country because there's a red notice out, and that's that it's a small world in so many aspects. But when you're operating a fintech, or when you're doing an ICO or whatever you're doing in the fintech space, you've really got to be mindful of all the jurisdictions, and I see that in that situation, there's an effort perhaps to avoid the jurisdiction, but obviously, at least right now, that it's not successful. So, I don't know about the merits of the case, but ultimately, it's going to have to be defended. And so, I mean, you really got to be mindful of this reality.
And how do you plan for that? What should a good compliance governance have, and what should you do besides hiring you, of course?
Exactly. Well, look, I mean, that's the silver lining here. I mean, the reality is, if you take, and it doesn't have to be onerous or exhaustive. I mean, if you take the right steps, if you put in the effort to try and create a compliant framework, that is going to stand you in good stead. I mean, it really is. If you approach this with good faith, and I understand the difficulties and the bureaucracy and perhaps the cost as well, but you put in the effort in the front end, it's going to pay in the back end and protect you, because it really, as I said earlier, the effort you put in to try and do the right thing and trying to create the compliant environment is worth half of the equation. And even if something goes wrong, you're not going to be penalized to the full extent if you did, in fact, try and do and create that environment and try and do the right thing. It really does drive that equation. And I can't even, there's countless examples now of that where, these kinds of cases get reported all the time where there's a severe penalty or a charge like this. But there are a lot of cases where there's a pass, there's no penalty, they don't get reported with as much press and publicity. But there are those cases, and there are many of them, where the individual or the corporation, tried to do the right thing and something went wrong, but they weren't penalized, or penalized severely. So there's, the first step is create that compliant framework, and then two, if something does go wrong, the worst thing to do is run for the hills and try and bury your head in the sand and avoid it. So 9 times out of 10, the best remedy is to address the situation head on.
Well, your firm even has an application for that, don't you?
We have an app,
like an emergency. Someone knocks at your door, like, what should I do?
Yeah, we do. The Defender app. It's on the you can get it on the iPhone store. Yeah. No, there was actually a case last weekend where someone was at home and there were law enforcement at the door, and the person couldn't get a hold of anyone. They used the app to try and get some quick advice. So, so we're very active in that space.
So it works.
It does. No question.
Nice.
But that old adage, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It really applies in this context.
Yes.
In the crypto space and the fintech space and anti-corruption and the anti-money laundering space. It really is the case.
Fantastic. And so we talked about prevention, and now we're talking about company is one thing, people are another thing. So
right,
you can't control that. I think there's going to be corruption in any big organization, and you can take steps to prevent it, but it can happen, and it can damage the organization. How do you make the organization survive if you get this call and maybe you were not as prepared as you should have, and that's a big issue for instance in the lava scheme of things,
right?
Because even though the companies had, it can be the CEO. The CEO is not the company.
Right.
You should arrest the CEO, but the company is something that you should at least try to protect. And there's value for, innocent shareholders. There's value for the market. There's value for the country. And if you damage it all and you wreck it all, there's nothing left. So how do you turn that around? What should you do?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, you hit the nail on the head, Gabriel. So, the DOJ has put out some guidance on this, and actually some factors that are taken into consideration, and the how they treat the corporation in these situations. And as you said, the corporation is more than one official, and it's a collection of shareholders, officers, staff, employees. All very vital parts of a corporation. And even if you don't have the best compliance program, you don't have the best compliance framework, you still can recover. You still can save the company, even in the worst of situations, even in cases where you've got multiple outposts where there's episodes of corruption. You're not. It's not a death sentence. As I said before, half of the equation is the prevention, and preparation aspect, but half of the equation is how you react to that knock on the door, to that subpoena, to that allegation of corruption, or that whistleblower who's just reported the company for wrongdoing. There's definitely aggravating factors. Multiple episodes, multiple subsidiaries, the same thing is happening in. But if you take the position, and this isn't every case. Every case is you have to evaluate on its own. But many times, if you take the position that you are going to engage the regulator, the first step is really to do your own inquiry, your own investigation, find out exactly what happened. Do a thorough dive and gather all the facts. And then when you realize, the extent of what's happened, take that corrective measures. Do what you should do, even if it should have been done earlier, even if there should have been preparation. Take those corrective actions and corrective measures. And if the second question the regulators and the officials always ask is, how high and how far does this go? meaning does it reach into the C-suite? Do the executives know, and did they condone the behavior? And that's a question you have to answer yourself before you even engage with the government. And you need to be honest about that and take the right action. And if it did reach that high, you're going to have to save the company. You're going to have to you're going to have to take some corrective measures. And unfortunately, not everyone can be spared. But if it means saving thousands of employee jobs, it may have to be done. And certainly, with public companies, that's going to be the case, even with large private companies. But even though you may have not done the diligence and the compliance effort earlier, act when you see there's a problem. Do that investigation, find out what happened, and then institute corrective measures and put that program in place as quickly as possible. And the other piece of it is, and I see companies all the time get themselves into deeper and deeper trouble. Don't fight it. I mean, there's going to be cases where, yes, there may be a mistake. There isn't the allegation is off. It's not accurate. Those cases you fight. But if in fact, what is alleged may have occurred, fighting the regulator may not be the best course. It's going to cause a much stiffer penalty. The best course is to engage and negotiate and open a line of communication and do the best to help resolve the issue, because cooperation, as some people find it very disdaining. However, if the goal is to save the company, that is a methodology that you really need to strongly consider. And it will, if you look at some of these press releases from the government on some of the announcements of these penalties, they will credit the company for helping, for cooperating, for helping them figure out what happened, for helping them gather information and evidence. And, it really can hugely benefit the company. And the employee, staff, shareholders, and directors. So never underestimate that you can save a bad situation. It is possible.
Yes. Don't cover up. Don't try to hide.
Yeah, I mean, burying evidence, destroying evidence. I mean, those are some of the worst things you can do.
Yes. We have a question from Fabio here. Robert, what are the main cyber crimes you've been dealing with in the last few years? If you have experience in cyber crimes, both as a prosecutor and as a lawyer, in both sides.
Sure. So, it's something. There's been a misperception in this area a lot. I think there's a lot of it. We were talking about this the other day. There's this perception out there that cyber usually means a lot of money laundering. In fact, the worst thing you can do if you're trying to hide or pass or promote unlawful transfers is to do it on the blockchain, because it leaves a total trail. It's just stupid. So there isn't really that concern, and you don't actually see that many cases.
Do regulators know that? Because I mean, it's heaven. You follow the money. The money the money trail's all there.
It's right. It can't be better than that, right? I mean, So you don't really see so many money laundering cases. What you unfortunately have seen, and I do think this is going to change, but you do see fraud especially in the ICO space, where there's been a raise and there's been the founders just steal
paper and they go to Vegas.
And it gives the whole space a bad name. But I think those cases get huge publicity, but I think you're going to start seeing less and less of those. And as you know, Gabriel, I mean, there's been the hacking cases are very prominent and troublesome. But again, the security is getting much better now, and the ability. And our firm does a lot of that. We're, responding to hacks. That's probably the most activity we're involved in. Is cyber hacks and cyber breaches. So that's a big area. And like I said, fraud, theft of assets. unfortunately, is another area.
Has the pandemic increased the services in that area and the need?
It's a good question. I think it hasn't slowed. I mean, it hasn't slowed. I think, the pandemic has definitely advanced and quickened the pace of the transition, I think, and this as well as anyone. I mean, to the pace of the adoption of fintech and the adoption of the blockchain and the various other activities and movement to smart contracts and all this other activity. I think I've seen the pandemic advance that quite a bit. On the back end, on the regulatory end, I haven't seen a pickup really in cases as a result of the pandemic. Now I think the regulatory activity is about the same. It's been about even throughout this period. There's definitely a focus on it. And then, you've had some big cases like the one you've just mentioned. There's been some big cases that have come down the pike recently. But, I think the pandemic hasn't caused an uptick in it, I don't think.
Well, if we can, I'd love to hear some juicy stories about those big cases, like for instance, the oil for food prosecution. How do you make the case? How does the investigation work? Did you have any shortcomings? Any interesting stories that you like to?
Yeah,
share?
well, I mean, let's see we've always had, there's tons of, it's like truth is much better than fiction, as they say. I mean, there's been a lot of great cases. I've been very fortunate. I mean, has never been a dull moment. I think, it's interesting. I think one of the big tools and the techniques that really have, driven the advancement of the investigations in this space has been the digital examinations, doing the imaging of the forensics, the electronic evidence. I mean, it's amazing to me how people still use email, and it's some of the best or the most problematic evidence is through electronic communications and other things where the folks think that those are secure, and it ends up being a huge smoking gun. So it's many of the cases were solved through that. We had even in the oil for food cases, there were the emails between some of the agents of the various corporations, and the inside officials were identified and developed through the email communications that we were able to find, and so that was the downfall of many, unfortunately. So yeah, I mean, there's been so many great cases. I'm trying to think of anything in particular. We had some of the cross-border of fraud cases were reached pretty high into some governments. We had some really unfortunate cases. We had a case where we were investigating. This is pretty apropos of what's happening now. We were investigating counterfeits in the health sector, and there was a company that created an alter ego to a very high-profile public company. They created their own. They made a mirror image of that company, including their packaging, their ingredients, and they stepped into the shoes of this company, and they started to intercede with the various contracts throughout the developing world, and they were actually providing medicines to these developing countries. But the problem is what they had in the packaging in the medicine was actually just chalk. It was nothing. And so here you are with these. You looked at the labeling, you looked at the packaging, you could never tell that this wasn't a legitimate medicine. But when you went to take it, you weren't taking anything. You were taking chalk. And it was amazing how sophisticated this effort was. So we actually had an undercover witness go into the factory grounds and take a secret video. He had a video camera on him.
Wow.
He filmed the whole area, where including in the factory floor where they were manufacturing the packaging of the actual company, and they were the employees or the people that were working on it were holding the pieces up and gloating, and they putting up side by side the real packaging with what they were manufacturing, and they were gloating about it. And if you looked at it, it was actually incredible how exact it was. And then they had help getting all these medicines into these various countries, and it went up in one case. It went up to close to the prime minister of the country. So we had cases like that all the time where we had some really amazing things. It was very unfortunate, though. Unfortunately, we were able to intercept a lot of that before it actually became a huge problem.
How do you know when you're investigating? How do you know you've reached the top? Because I mean, when you look, for instance, at drug dealers, I can't place the head of an international drug cartel living in a favela. I honestly can't.
Right.
So I know I know for sure there's someone above him. How do you know you got the right person?
Well, typically the way these cases are worked is that you start at the bottom, you start at the street level or the lower levels, and you work up. And one of the things that the U.S. does is that they have a combination of very strong laws, statutes which carry mandatory minimums. They have quite a number of tools, including wiretaps and various other things. And they'll get someone to cooperate with them. They'll bring in a cooperator, they'll wire the person up, and they'll send that person back into the organization to record conversations with all his colleagues and all his cohorts. And they'll gather tapes. In some of these cases, they'll be undercover for 2 years. And they'll have hundreds and hundreds of tapes. And this is not just in the drug trafficking area. This is in political corruption, too. I mean, this is the way those cases are made also. And so then you start gathering information and evidence, and you've got these former participants who are now cooperating with you that are both doing proactive investigation, and also they're telling you who the senior people are and who all the players are in the organization. So your job as an investigator or prosecutor or agent is to make the case. I mean, it's one thing to know, but that doesn't do you any good. You got to have an actual prosecutable case. So then you gather your evidence. You then, you want to, get tapes, get them on tape. You want to get phone calls, emails, video, and so that's the effort. And the goal, if you do it right, your goal is to get as high as it goes. So, the end of the food chain, as they say, that's the parlance that's often used. So you want to, you'll go until the logical end of the case, until as high up as it reaches. And so, sometimes you don't have the luxury of being able to wait. Remember, in one case we were on a wiretap, and it was a gang case. It was a racketeering case, and we heard on the wiretap that the head of the organization was going to get killed. They were going to shoot him. So we couldn't allow that to happen, right? So we had to intercept and take the case down before the logical end of the case, so the guy wouldn't get whacked. So, things like that happen, right? Wow. And so then you can't, as you're sitting there on a wire listening to this, you can't allow someone to get killed. So obviously you need to act. And so that case came down prematurely. But, ultimately, that's the goal. And in many cases it happens. And the way the system is designed, at least in the U.S., and I think now in Brazil, in many ways, I know now that the MPF are using leniency agreements. Yes. And that's the tool. You get the lower level folks, and then you give them the opportunity for a leniency agreement, and they have to cooperate and provide you with truthful information. And then you work your way up. And so that sometimes it takes years, but that's the goal of those kinds of cases.
Awesome. And focusing now on the practice of the law, like just to get your sense on it, How are you dealing with the pandemic right now? How is your office dealing with that?
Yeah,
Was it an easy transition into working from
yeah,
home? And I know you have a nice place, nice spot in Manhattan, which is
yeah,
basically
yeah.
no man's land right now. So how
Right.
is
No,
everything your
yeah.
end?
It's been really rough. I mean, I have to say that the support with modern technology, our IT folks did an amazing job of setting up our capabilities, and we really haven't missed a beat. I mean, with the way technology is today, and you know full well. I mean, with the advent, it's funny because we were just joking the other day about if this pandemic had happened 20 years ago, we'd be ground to a halt. But with modern technology and all the advancements today with IT, we set up remotely, and it's not as good not seeing your colleagues on a daily basis. It's hard. I mean, it's in that sense, it's really rough. But in terms of working for our clients and the practice, we're able to do it as well as if we were in the office full time. And we have great support, so we're able to do everything we could have done in the office, but doing it remotely. And hopefully we'll be back soon. But it's I think pretty much the entire industry is in the same boat, and really the capabilities are such that it's possible. There's remote Zoom proceedings now with the courts. It's interesting. There's a real issue now with criminal cases, and what's going on in the courts is whether or not criminal cases can proceed if the defendants aren't able to actually be in the courtroom. But more and more courts are allowing it, and so we're almost back to full activity. Really, it slowed at the beginning, no question. The first couple of months there was very little activity, but it really has picked up in the last couple. And I think it's really going to drive a more permanent change to the industry. Both the court activity, litigation, and just the practice in and of itself. I think, as you say, I mean, I don't know. I think some firms are going to rethink whether they need so much space in very expensive cities.
That's what I was going to ask. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not cheap at all to keep an
No.
office in the big
No.
cities, in New York,
Definitely
Sao
not.
Paulo, so those spaces. And things are going well. I mean, for those who manage to adapt, I mean, even better. Going into court through Zoom, it's a much better experience sometimes.
Yes. Yes. No question.
And
No question.
nice.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
So, Bob, we're reaching the end of the hour here,
Okay.
and we usually ask for some information recommendations from our guests, like books and podcasts and websites. So, let's name it one, but you can name more. One book that you like. It can be about anything or compliance, one podcast or
Yeah.
documentary on what we would say an alternative source of information,
Sure. Sure.
and
Sure.
anything else you would add to
Yeah.
the mix.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know if I'm going to. This is a book I just finished reading. I'm not going to. It's not an endorsement of it, but I think it's very interesting reading based on everything that's happened. In the last few months with the government, central banks stepping in and pumping in so much currency and into the system. I've just read a very interesting book called The Great Devaluation, which talks about the long-standing effects of the money printing and the fiscal stimulus. It's a little scary. I don't want to, it doesn't pretend a very, very happy ending, but it sounds like, the thesis is there's a lot of pain to come, but it's extraordinarily interesting if you're at all interested in these economic type issues. So I would recommend it. Very well written.
Nice.
Yeah.
It's somewhat popular in the blockchain circles as well, I think.
Oh, is it?
Many people, many people adhere to those theses, and
right.
And it's a very interesting, very interesting subject.
Yeah.
And what about the other sources of information? I mean, a documentary, movie, or a podcast.
Trying to think. Well, there's a colleague of mine at FTI who's been doing a number of very interesting podcasts on this subject we're even talking about today, who has been publishing them and done some really neat some interviews on that. And I'm trying to think what else. I mean, things like what you're doing are just great sources. I mean, I find now without going to be able to go to the movie theater, I'm much more attuned to Netflix and also to the YouTube and to these types of podcasts. Just have a wealth of information, very very useful, and it's certainly worth the effort to dive into it and find relevant subjects. And I mean, I think there's a wealth of information out there, and obviously the challenge is to separate the credible from the rest. But it's a very exciting time to be learning about all this, especially in the your area and the fintech digital currency space. I mean, I find that fascinating, just fascinating. I think it's the future. I mean, I've been reading about the governments now trying to get into stable coins and adopting digital currencies. And as you know, we've talked about that. And I think, that's very much the future. And it's interesting to me seeing how there's still quite a number of folks who don't see it coming and are very reluctant and are very critical of. So I was just reading some very prominent economists who are very anti, cryptocurrency, and it's amazing to me to see that when I really do think it's the future.
Yeah, I mean, programmable money, programmable assets, those things make law completely different, in my opinion. It's going to be very interesting to be a lawyer in those spaces. And if you think about compliance, I mean, if you have everything on a blockchain, you won't be able to avoid it. You need someone to design everything.
Yeah,
from the
beginning. There's going to be a record. There's going to be a trail. It's tremendous.
Yes. Well, any final messages you wish to leave to the Brazilian audience?
Yeah, no, I would strongly encourage folks to be engaging, and if not to be intimidated, and to address any of the issues head on, and certainly happy to help and willing to help any of your folks that are your followers and in your audience. All I can do.
Awesome, Bob. Well, thank you so much. I mean, what amazing story you have, and what a nice guy. I can tell you. Well, it's been a real pleasure being with you.
Yeah,
and
likewise.
Talking to you every time.
I'm very honored to have you asked me to join you today. I'm very honored. It was a lot of fun.
So, guys, thanks so much, audience, for this. Thank you, people. Please do follow us. Sigam a gente. Hit the like button and curtam o vídeo. And we'll see you in the next Papo de Mercado. So I'm ending the broadcast.
Thank you.